Well, the Old Testament contains many rich and interesting historical accounts of God's people that span more than 4,000 years. However, this important record is under attack today by critics and archaeologists who have claimed that the biblical account of history is inaccurate or in many cases just outright fictitious. Well-known events and people such as Joseph, the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, and the conquest of Jericho have all been challenged on archaeological grounds. For example, this Time magazine edition features the work of an archaeologist by the name of Kathleen Kenyon, who excavated at Jericho for 6 years, and she claimed that the city was destroyed by the Egyptians more than 1,000 years before the Israelites were in Canaan. Kathleen Kenyon asserts this. She says, parts of the Old Testament where the evidence is contradictory or still absent, including slavery in Egypt, the existence of Moses, the Exodus, and Joshua's military conquest of the Holy Land, she says these parts are contradictory. There's no archaeological evidence for this. Well, rather than just accepting such claims of science, whether it be from archaeology, geology, or astronomy, it is important that we trust the Bible as authoritative on early Earth history and be ready to make a defense, as we're told in 1 Peter 3:15. Christians need to study apologetics like biblical archaeology, and we need to love the Lord with our mind as we're instructed in Matthew 22:37, and prepare ourselves for service to Him through the study of apologetics. While some may consider the Old Testament unimportant because we're New Testament churches, we must keep in mind that the Bible is part of a single book spanning thousands of years. If one part of this book is viewed as inaccurate, that view will ripple through the rest of the book and challenge belief in other parts like the gospel. This is well summarized by the words of Jesus when responding to the Jews about His authority and witness. He said, "If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But since you do not believe what he wrote, how are you going to believe what I say?" Or similarly, in His response to Nicodemus, Jesus says, "I have spoken to you of earthly things, and you do not believe. How then will you believe if I speak of heavenly things?" If we do not trust the Bible on historical matters, how can we trust it on spiritual matters like salvation? Well, tonight, first, we're going to look at how the Egyptian chronology fits into biblical history. We'll focus on some of the problems that are faced when attempting to make a correct alignment of events or personages between Egypt and the Bible. We will then examine newly discovered evidence of Joseph in Egypt. And I will introduce to you what is known as the Bar Yosef, which means a waterway of Joseph. That might be an interesting connection to the Joseph of the Bible. And lastly, we'll return to reviewing the archaeological support for the exodus of the vast Israelite slaves from Egypt and the conquest of Jericho. Support which is vast if you're looking at the right time. Well, Egypt has been particularly challenging to biblical historians and archaeologists when attempting to place some key biblical events into the chronology of Egypt. So, let's start at the beginning. Egypt comes into existence soon after the dispersion from Babel around 2100 BC. Egypt was settled by descendants of Misraim, who, according to the book of Genesis, was Noah's grandson, the son of Noah's son, Ham. Genesis 10:6 reads, in the NASB reads, "The sons of Ham, or Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan." You can also note that in both the ESV and the NIV translations, this passage instead reads, "The sons of Ham were Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan." Those translations insert Egypt in place of Mizraim. Or note in Genesis 50, 10 and 11, that the place where Joseph mourned over the death of Jacob was called Abel Mizraim, meaning mourning of the Egyptians. You can read it here. "When the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, 'The Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning.' That is why that place near the Jordan is today called Abel Mizraim, or then mourning of the Egyptians." Eusebius, who was a 4th century historian who is often referred to as the father of church history because of his work in recording the history of the early Christian church, stated this about the origin of Egypt. He said, "Egypt is called Mizraim by the Hebrews, and Mizraim lived not long after the flood. For after the flood, Shem, son of Noah, beget Egyptus, or Mizraim, who was the first to set out to establish himself in Egypt. At the time when the tribes began to disperse this way and that, Mizraim was indeed the founder of the Egyptian race, and from him the first Egyptian dynasty must be held to spring." It's from Mizraim that we get Misr, the present Egyptian name for Egypt. Modern Egyptians call themselves Misr, the Arabic word for Egypt. Note the word on the insurance sign in the background. This is the case for most countries, I find. Most countries name themselves something different than other people call them. Like Korea is Hanguk, if I remember correct. America in Korea is called Miguk. Migo Sanamyeo is I am an American. But we call it Korea for some reason, even though they call themselves Hanguk. I don't know where that comes from. You could understand it more if it was just a slightly different pronunciation of that place. But anyway, in dealing with Egyptian events, we need to recognize that there's a serious problem with Egyptian chronology that is causing dates to extend far beyond what the Bible would allow. The Egyptian chronologies are especially plagued by incomplete data. There are inscriptions that give long lists of pharaohs, but the length of their reigns are either omitted or else the numbers have been obliterated over time. Dynasties, which were a period of family ruling, are designated by the numbers 1st, 2nd, 3rd, etc. You see on this diagram, those are the dynasty numbers. And these are grouped into sets called Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. You can see that on this diagram as well. But also note that between these sets are intermediate periods where the history is even less clear. And these periods are problematic. But the main problem with the Egyptian chronology is made obvious by the mere fact that it extends beyond 3000 BC, which requires that Noah's global flood occurred hundreds of years into Egyptian history. Well, first, where did the Egyptian history come from? It was compiled from numerous inscriptions, texts, papyrus documents, and artifacts, as well as ancient writings from historians such as Manetho. Manetho composed a history of Egypt for the Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. Also from Herodotus, the famous Greek historian who traveled to Egypt in the 5th century BC and interviewed priests and other knowledgeable individuals. We also have material from Josephus, the famous Jewish historian. He quoted from Manetho when writing his historical anthologies in the 1st century AD. Africanus and Bishop Eusebius were renowned historians writing in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, respectively. They also quoted Manetho and wrote about Egyptian history. However, all of these highly esteemed historians often disagree with one another in the calculation of Egyptian chronology. In addition, the heavy reliance on Manetho creates obvious problems. Manetho was an Egyptian priest who wrote a history of Egypt in the 3rd century BC, and today many considered Manetho's writings to be indisputable fact. He was skilled at deciphering hieroglyphs and had access to inscriptions, documents, and other valuable artifacts. However, two problems emerge. First, Manetho was writing hundreds and some even thousands of years after some of the actual events had taken place. Second, none of Manetho's writings exist today. The only source we have for Manetho's writings are quotes by much later historians such as Josephus, Africanus, and Eusebius. Well, the length of the dynasties comes from Manetho, but again, none of his writings have survived, and dates have come from various interpretations of what is known as the Sothic cycle. The intermediate periods that I mentioned before, I've circled them for you here, are a big part of the problem. These are historically dark periods when there was no central controlling dynasty in Egypt. Instead, there were several dynasties reigning at the same time. The result is that guesses have been made as to how long they reigned and whether each reigning period was shared or not. The failure early on to recognize that many of these dynasties were contemporary or coexistent with each other led to a terrible stretching of the Egyptian timeline. With this stretched standard chronology, Joseph, you'll see here, is placed in Egypt during the second intermediate period. But there is no sign of him then. And Moses is placed in the new kingdom, where we find no effect of the devastating plagues and the destruction of Pharaoh and his army at that kingdom. Furthermore, archaeologists find poverty rather than a period of affluence at the time of Solomon, when he was supposed to have lived. During the Iron Age 1B, you find only shoddy-looking pottery. There's no evidence of powerful cities or walls or fortifications or anything like it. There's no jewelry. Today, secular archaeologists are vigorously attacking this story of Solomon, saying that there's no evidence to support his reign as described in the Bible, but plenty of evidence that contradicts it. If Solomon is a fake story, then what part of the Bible can you trust? But again, you have to look at the right time. Let me provide a couple of obvious examples to illustrate the problem with Egyptian chronology. This is the Black Obelisk, as is known. It was erected as a public monument in Assyria in 825 BC. And it contains the most ancient description we have of an Israelite king, King Jehu, who had come to Assyria to pay tribute to the Emperor Shalmaneser III. In this close-up, you can see the tribute being brought. Well, according to Assyrian chronology, Shalmaneser III reigned from 859 to 824 BC. According to the biblical chronology, King Jehu reigned from 841 to 814 BC. That's a difference of only a decade and illustrates how well the biblical and Assyrian historical records align. However, we find stark deviation between the Assyrian and Egyptian chronologies when referencing, for example, the Hittites. Egyptologist David Down, shown here, summarizes the problem. He says, according to the Egyptian chronology, the Hittites were wiped out in 1200 BC. But the Assyrians write of wars between the Hittites in the 8th and 9th century BC. What were the Hittites doing 500 years after they were supposedly wiped out? Not only are the Assyrians making war against the Hittites in the 8th and 9th centuries, but they war against kings with the same names as recorded in the Hittite records. Ladies and gentlemen, there's clearly a problem with the Egyptian chronology. Some biblical archaeologists and Egyptologists have proposed dramatically collapsing the standard Egyptian chronology timescale shown here and harmonizing it with the biblical chronology by aligning key events. Here's a proposed revised chronology by the Egyptologist David Down. In this revised chronology, Abraham visited Egypt during the Old Kingdom, and Joseph was in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom. The exodus of Israel from Egypt overturned the Middle Kingdom and brought about a period of desolation. Well, one of the main factors responsible for distorting the biblical Egyptian synchrony, or our attempt to synchronize these, is the misinterpretation of this verse, causing some scholars to place Moses and the Exodus late in Egyptian history. The verse is this, Genesis 1:11. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh the store cities of Pithom and Ramses. Well, due to the mention of the Israelites building the store city of Ramses in Exodus 1, many scholars have argued that Ramses II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. But he was a 19th dynasty New Kingdom ruler. And this places the Exodus much later than the biblical chronology, at 1225 BC rather than 1446 BC. This date is much too late for reasons previously mentioned, but also, and probably not most significant, is that we find Ramses' mummy in the Cairo Museum rather than at the bottom of the Red Sea, where it would be if he was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, right? Because Egypt's army all died in the Red Sea. Well, although the mention of the city of Ramses in Exodus 1 is literally the only historical evidence given for the later date of 1225 BC for the event, this view has become popularized by mainstream media in virtually every film and every TV show about the Exodus. Perhaps most notable is Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments with Yul Brynner and Charlton Heston. However, there are numerous problems with aligning Ramses just from the biblical text alone. The name place of Ramses in Exodus 1 is clearly an anachronism used by the author because that is what the city was known by at a later time. Either Ramses named that city or region after himself, or was given the name in honor of him, much like we've named Washington State after George Washington. Now, this is clearly shown in Scripture. Note here that in Genesis 47, the Pharaoh assigned the land of Goshen to Joseph's family in verse 6, but in verse 11 here, the same area is described as the land of Ramses. It says here in Genesis 47, 10 through 11, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Well, this is at least 200 years before the Exodus. And in Exodus 1 also tells us that a new Pharaoh did not know Joseph, that a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph was responsible for the oppressive slavery of Israel. It reads, Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built Pharaoh's store cities, Pithom and Ramses. Plus, in Exodus 2:23 states that the Pharaoh who oppressed Israel is dead, and there is a new Pharaoh when Moses returns to Egypt, which means that the Pharaoh of Exodus 1:11 and the Pharaoh of the Exodus cannot be the same. At least two pharaohs had died between those. Also, if Ramses II was a builder of the city of Ramses in Exodus 1:11, then he would have had to have been reigning over Egypt for over 80 years. We know this because in verse 11, Moses is not yet born, and Moses did not return to Egypt as deliverer until he was 80 years old. Ramses II actual reign was 66 years. Well, the late date for the Exodus is in fact proven quite unlikely by Egyptian historical records as well. Merneptah was Ramses II's son and ruled after him. In 1208 BC, he writes in his own words that Israel was already in the land of Canaan during his reign. On this stone slab, called the Merneptah Stela, it details his conquest of the lands of Libya and Canaan, including the people of Israel, stating, Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. Now, this stela is an important reference to a people called Israel outside the Bible and stands as powerful evidence for a much earlier Exodus than during the reign of Ramses II. Because it testifies to the existence of Israel as a powerful entity in the land of Canaan during Merneptah's reign. But according to the Bible, the Israelites did not even begin to conquer Canaan until after they had wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. It is not possible that the Israelites could leave Egypt as slaves in 1225 BC, wander in the wilderness for 40 years, and enter Canaan to become a powerful people so well established in the land with a powerful military that by 1208 BC, a great Pharaoh would brag about defeating them. So, the solution to the problem of biblical synchrony with Egypt is a recognition that the chronology of Egypt needs to be reduced by centuries, bringing the 12th dynasty down to the time of Moses and the Exodus. When this is done, there is found abundant evidence for the presence of large numbers of Semitic slaves at the time of Moses, the devastation of Egypt, and also the sudden departures of slaves can be found by archaeology.